Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for this week's review, I was granted a copy of Missing Middle Games, They Don't Sleep. For those not in the know, it's a short survival-oriented roguelite that tasks you with managing the well-being of a mother and her child, while murdering zombies and working on an escape route. Join me as I dive in to decide if this was a dilemma I didn't want to doze on, or a botched bout of boring babysitting. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. For Kaya, the day had started mundanely enough. Another long walk back home alongside her husband Rob. As a mother, the secluded house hadn't been her first option, especially once the truck broke down. But perhaps it was for the best. After all, when the zombie apocalypse suddenly hit, they weren't in the midst of the city, for what little good it did her husband. In an instant, she finds herself a widow, and then a corpse when her zombified neighbor focused its attention on her. Only, that wasn't the end of it. For some unfathomable reason, Kaya finds herself waking up moments before her death, stuck in a morbid time loop that sees her living through the same days over and over again, providing her both the means of salvaging some semblance of hope for herself and her child, and an excess of time to lament the choices that led her to this moment. It also meant I had a healthy amount of time to contemplate the fact that They Don't Sleep introduced an in-universe explanation for its roguelike mechanics, without ever really explaining the logistics of it. Like, yes, it also doesn't really go into details with the zombie apocalypse, but zombies, we get it. But I felt that was sort of moot, since it's less an exploration of the collapse of society and more a strenuous trial for players to navigate while also being a parent. Frankly, they could have replaced all the zombies with packs of dog-sized rabid squirrels and they would have fulfilled the same exact narrative purpose. That said, given that they make the time loop both central and have the characters acknowledge it, it felt weird that there was no clarification on it. That said, if you don't get hung up on those logistics, the story is otherwise alright. For the new game mode, you have an intro that lays the foundation for everything, but beyond that, your primary source of narrative elements is actually tied to your death-induced looping, as you make fresh journal entries each time. That said, be careful not to skip these if you are interested, given you can't actually reference earlier entries. What's more, you don't actually get a fully fleshed out ending unless you beat the game and dive into the New Game Plus mode, which is less of a New Game Plus and more of a second stage with its own nuances, a fresh batch of new journal entries to earn by dying, and an actual ending this time around. Though if you're like me and wound up a little bit overpowered from the first stage, you might want to intentionally die a whole bunch to see all the journal entries before seeing the ending. Really, there's only so many deaths you'll have to endure before it stops turning a new page on the journal. Now, I know it might sound a little bit weird for me to comment on being overpowered in a simulator-oriented roguelite focused on parenthood during a corpse-infested apocalypse, but, well, okay, let's break it down. The goal of each chapter is simple enough. You need to fetch the parts needed for the escape vehicle at your base and then repair it, while simultaneously doing your best to ensure that your base parameter isn't breached by the constant onslaught of cadavers being less than neighborly. That, and doing your best to keep on top of the personal and supply needs for both yourself and your baby. And these time management elements are then further compounded by the simple fact that the number of zombies which come to play gradually escalates as the days go by, forcing you to make efficient use of your time if you don't want to end up getting overwhelmed. And that's actually a pretty tricky prospect, given that while you're doing certain activities like retrieving objects from town, all of that time is causing your hunger gauge to begin tanking, your stress to spike, your exhaustion to build up, and your bladder to fill. All of which need to be addressed in a timely fashion, as once a gauge depletes, you have a neat little countdown before you promptly keel over dead. That is a really quick case of sepsis when it comes to the bladder, but fine. Also, it's 100% plausible for multiple gauges to start bottoming out in tandem, especially if your kid decides they want to shart themselves just moments after you've changed their diaper and left to scavenge, or decide to have a temper tantrum and start crying, tanking their own comfort and stressing you out while you're busy being attacked by a horde of zombies tearing apart your base. Honestly, things are a bit of a nightmare sometimes, so it was a bit of a relief when I realized that the game's RPG elements are actually fairly forgiving, and maybe a tiny bit broken in the case of certain skills. I personally swear by the fitness one because it just contributes so much to your survival. See, normally you have a relatively low cap of items you can scavenge in town, but higher levels can crank your cap to the point that you can just haul an entire week's worth of supplies in a single trip. It also increases your movement speed, saving you oodles of precious time, and makes the needs management side of the Sims a bit less harrowing. It outright reduces the amount of fatigue you gain to the point that at level 30, you just stop getting tired, which is a stat you don't have to manage, and that's why I feel it's a little bit unbalanced to the point where, while the other skills certainly have their uses, fitness definitely felt central to my success and more or less a no-brain pick for a while compared to the rest of them. Hell, at the speed I was moving, it felt like a legitimate tactic to stroll out of the house in the middle of a horde attack in order to bait all the zombies into ignoring my home and just chasing me in circles. I was so quick, I generally had enough time to take a shop, reposition, and kite entire groups while farming up supplies from the kills I was making. There is actually an aiming element to this game where you have to stand still and be close to a zombie to facilitate getting a better shot, and that doesn't matter when you're super fast. Which might be why the second chapter of the game is so different from the first, because you can't actually leave the confines of your base in that one. You don't get to scavenge supplies from just farming kills or trick zombies into leaving your house alone. You just have to learn how to properly manage your time and supplies in order to build up a suitable cache of necessities and find the time to make repairs, whether to your walls or the escape vehicle, between what felt like somewhat more consistent zombie waves. To the point that I was actually relieved whenever I got the message that a quiet night had arrived and nothing new was arriving. It's not that killing zombies is difficult either. Finding the sweet spot of how close you need to be in order to take a clean shot and occasionally doubling back to get more ammo is pretty straightforward. But if you get bogged down by chores and children, it's only a matter of time before the days begin to slip away, and you find yourself fending off larger and larger streams of bodies, only briefly punctuated by bathroom breaks, bawling babies, and bowls of borscht. Look, I just needed that alliteration to hit home. Sue me. Speaking of which, I'll give the game credit. Not for the soup, but for the fact that the infuriating wail of the baby whenever it was upset definitely stirred a primordial sense of fury within me. Though less fierce parent instincts and more, for the love of God, please stop. The horrific stress I felt as I beelined across the map and through the house to pick up a bawling baby to soothe it, only to step out of the house and be freshly greeted by it crying again from a fully loaded diaper it provided so much context to why the birth rate is declining. Beyond that, I have to say the rest of the sound effects are decent enough and don't instill any sort of trauma, which is a plus. Likewise, the music's alright, though I'd be hard-pressed to remember it once I was out of the game. As for the visual front, I found it to be a decent experience, nothing too fancy, but it gets the job done. Notably, I was pretty grateful for the UI because it does a solid job of highlighting just how you're disappointing your family at a given moment. But what's this mean at the end of the day? Well, They Don't Sleep is a decent way to pass a few hours if you don't mind only having a narrow slice of narrative and enjoy a bit of resource management. Really, it's figuring out how to optimize the loops that's the high point of the game here, given that the combat's fairly rudimentary, and despite roguelike being in its tags, there's not a whole lot that will separate your runs from each other beyond having higher base skills and a better understanding of what you should be doing at a given moment. That's not to say I don't like it. I wouldn't have footage of me being grotesquely overlevel if I didn't take some sort of weird satisfaction at breaking the game and surviving until day 60 or something, but it really isn't that long until you see what the game has to offer you. There are no alternate zombie types, there's just gradually escalating numbers of walkers and the rigors of survival. And that's why I'd ultimately have to rate They Don't Sleep as a fumble. It's a very simple, iterative experience, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if you want to shut your brain off and go through the motions, especially if you're a fan of simish stuff. Though, if you're the story-oriented self and you really just want to read all the journals, seriously, just die a whole lot intentionally. The second part also really shouldn't be called New Game Plus, since if you want to see all of the first segment story, you'll actually need to reset your save file if you've beaten and moved on. And likewise, progress in the story vis-a-vis deaths in the second part also isn't saved if you clear it. So, go through the loops of killing yourself if you actually are the sort of lore-hungry sort, though you're probably not missing too much there. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you folks on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then.